Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Michael Gutierrez. I'm a behavior analyst here at the Center for Development and Disability at the University of Mexico. Are very proud to have with us David Cox, He is presenting today on the philosophical premises for BACB ethics and compliance code. And this will count as the one-for-one towards your ethics requirements. A little bit of a bio. Dave Cox is a BCBA. He received his BS degree in psychology from Arizona State and graduate degrees in bioethics and applied behavior analysis from Union Graduate College and the University of North Texas. He's working in the field of ABA since 2006. He's currently a PhD student studying behavior analysis within the Department of Psychology at the University of Florida. His current focus, his research focus includes quantitative models of choice and preference in the laboratory and natural settings, behavioral economics, behavioral ecology, verbal behavior, resurgence, and the application of the aforementioned areas of ethical and health-related behavior. He is currently affiliated with Behavioral Health and Technology Research Fund, where he is the Director of Research. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to David.
Awesome. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. So as mentioned, I'll be chatting with you guys today about philosophical premises underlying the BACB Professional and Ethical Compliance Code, and really pretty much most healthcare ethical codes. And in addition, the latter half of the presentation, I'll get into some ideas or some things that really fascinated me since I first found behavior analysis as a science and behaviorism as a philosophy back when I was completing my master's in bioethics. So to start, I want to begin today by framing the dialogue with a few quotes. So the first here is from Nietzsche. And this first quote really gets at the heart of what I hope you all take away from this presentation today. And this will kind of be the focus of the first half of the talk. Specifically is this idea that creating and enforcing ethical rules is often relatively easy compared to justifying why those are the rules that we should espouse. And so after we talk about the types of questions that can be asked at varying levels of focus, we'll chat a bit about some of the dominant ethical theories that can be found in the language of our own code of ethics as well as other codes of ethics within healthcare. The second quote that's on the screen really gets at the heart of why I think it is important for you to think about these things and why you should care. And that's going to really be the focus of the second half of this presentation. And again, kind of this gets at the idea of what I've been interested in for the last couple years. And more specifically, as with all other behavior, verbal behavior, including ethical statements, has a function. Right? And however, the function or purpose of most of these rules has not been demonstrated empirically, but rather rests on certain philosophical premises. And for our own code, these are based in Western ethical traditions. So I'm going to argue and hopefully demonstrate that by understanding how we currently justify ethical rules that are meant to guide our profession, we can subsequently be more ready to adapt and change in the future as contingencies surrounding ethical behavior change, both at the individual practitioner level as well as the level of our profession. All right. So why justification is hard? So within applied behavior analysis, we currently have the Professional and Ethical Compliance Code for behavior analysts. And many of us have been taught to follow these rules. And these rules are meant to guide our behavior across several domains of professional practice, including responsible conduct of behavior analysts, assessing behavior, public statements, so on and so forth. And all of these rules are great in and of themselves, and I have no intention of debating that these should in fact be the guidelines by which we as behavior analysts measure whether or not the behavior we emit on a daily basis can be tagged as ethical. However, being a scientist, a bioethicist, and a behavior analyst by training, when I first came into contact with these guidelines, I found myself behaving in line with the characteristic espoused by all sciences, including behavior analysis, and that characteristic being philosophic doubt. Now, behaving in accord with philosophic doubt subsequently leads one to ask two primary questions. And these questions are, what do you mean by X? And as behavior analysts, we're relatively decent at answering these questions, right? What do you mean by honesty? What do you mean by compassion? Things like that. We're decent at coming up with operational definitions. But the second question relative to philosophic doubt, how do you know X, requires some more thought. So that is, how do we know that behaving in some way is right or wrong? And to answer this question, we can kind of break it down further and ask, what exactly are the assumptive values that our compliance code uses to justify the particular rules that are present within the code? In addition, we can also ask, how do we know that the rules for behavior we have emitted within the compliance code are actually the most effective and efficient rules for BCBAs and BCABAs to obtain those end goals or values or whatever we're after? Stated differently and perhaps more succinctly, what is the purported function of these rules, and how do we know these rules are effective relative to that function? And we can ask these questions at several levels. So we can begin by asking these questions about each individual guideline or each individual rule. So for example, section 8.06 of the compliance code states that behavior analysts do not solicit or use testimonials about behavior analytic services from current clients for publication on their web pages and so on and so forth. But we can ask, why is that? Why is it bad if we do? And similarly, why is it good if we don't? And moving above asking these questions about the individual guidelines, we can also ask about what do we do in situations where guidelines are in conflict? How do we pick among the different guidelines in terms of which one we follow? And furthermore, if we can come to a conclusion as to which guideline to follow, we can ask ourselves, why is it that that's the route we've chosen as the best decision to make in that instance? Finally, in addition to individual rules and the interaction of these rules or guidelines, we can also move above the compliance code as a whole, and we can ask about the cultural contingencies that result in the creation and maintenance of these rules. So much of what provides the justificatory framework for the compliance code comes from a Western philosophical tradition of statements regarding good and bad and right and wrong. But in thinking about this actually ends up begging the question of how do we know that the Western-based justificatory framework is the most effective route toward governing behavior relative to the function of these guidelines, especially as we move across cultures in different locations within the world and grow globally as a profession. So in sum, by asking and thinking about these questions, I think it is fair to state that there are a lot of questions that can be asked about why we espouse the ethical statements that we do. And whether it highlights opportunity or perhaps evokes disappointment in you as a listener, our empirical understanding of the verbal behavior relative to these ethical rules really is lacking. But luckily, we're also not the first people to think about this stuff. And although a natural account of ethical behavior has yet to be fully developed, many writers throughout recorded history have explored various ways to justify ethical behavior using logic. And so we're going to discuss three of the more dominant paradigms. Oops, clicking ahead of myself. We're going to discuss three of the more dominant paradigms. But however, I do want to state that there are a variety of ethical theories that we're not really going to touch on today, but are perhaps very relevant, such as John Rawls' social contract theory and stuff like that. So the first dominant ethical theory that we're going to chat about today is virtue ethics. So virtue ethics states that moral excellence or virtue is the proper focus of reflection on ethics, and rules for action should be derivative of those virtues. So in attempts to kind of translate this into behavior analytic terms, the definition of a virtue, such as honesty or generosity, is not just a tendency to behave in an honest or generous manner, but rather a behavior that has become fluent within an individual's repertoire. They don't have to try or emit too much response effort to engage in it. It has also become maintained by non-social reinforcement or automatic reinforcement. So that is, an organism would behave in a manner tacted as honest regardless of any socially mediated consequences that would or would not occur. Now, virtue ethics founding fathers are considered to be some of the ancient philosophers such as Lao Tzu, as well as Plato, and more particularly Aristotle. And virtue ethics persisted really as the dominant approach in Western moral philosophy until at least the Enlightenment. And then it suffered a momentary eclipse, as some writers call it, during the 19th century, but really reemerged in the late 1950s in Anglo-American philosophy, and is a very active area of ethical philosophy today. There's actually a book published, I think it was last year or the year before, if people are curious. And so this is kind of the general idea of virtue ethics. And although it may sound a bit slippery, we actually have an example of a virtue-based code within the compliance code. This would be guideline 1.04, where we talk about behavior analysts being truthful and honest, and they should be truthful and honest because that's a good thing to be. So a virtue ethicist, in arguing that someone's behaving ethically relative to being truthful and honest, would say that the behavior analyst who is truthful and honest because it is maintained by non-socially mediated reinforcement is a more ethical behavior analyst than the one who is truthful and honest only to perhaps avoid or escape some aversive stimuli or contact reinforcement. Right? We would expect the former behavior analyst to be truthful and honest across a variety of circumstances and thus be called virtuous. Whereas the other, there may be contingencies or arrangements or environments in which they would behave dishonestly. So we can never really be sure which they are. The second dominant paradigm in current Western ethical thought is consequentialism. And I'll give you guys a moment to read this Calvin and Hobbes slide here while I get a sip of water. Hopefully you guys enjoy that. It's always fun when you can slip a little Calvin and Hobbes in your presentations. But in any event, so consequentialism, also known as utilitarianism, essentially argues that the results of an action are what determine whether it is right or wrong. And this view arose primarily through the work of Jeremy Bentham in 1789, John Stuart Mill in 1861, and Henry Sidgwick in 1907. And as a quick segue, Sidgwick actually has a book called Methods of Ethics, which is really good. I'm reading it right now. I highly recommend it if anybody's curious. But in any event, these classical consequentialists held what is considered today to be total hedonistic consequentialism. And this really combines two ideas. One is called act consequentialism and one is called hedonism. So act consequentialism is the claim that an act or a behavior is deemed good or bad if and only if that act maximizes the good. That is, if and only if the total amount of good for all minus the total amount of bad for all is greater than the net amount of good and bad that would result from any other behavior that could have been emitted at that moment of choice. Hedonism, the other aspect of these original thinkers, claims that pleasure is the only good and that pain and aversiveness is the only bad. When we talk about Skinner's writings later on, we'll see he has a little bit of this flavor. But in any event, the classical consequentialists, again, combine the act consequentialism and hedonism and essentially claim that a behavior is morally right if and only if that act causes the greatest happiness for the greatest number, which is the common slogan that they use. Now, there are technically a number of different utilitarian or consequentialist theories or arguments or considerations, but that's really beyond the scope of this presentation. The main point that I want to highlight here is that consequentialist or utilitarianist theory tries to justify ethical action by appealing to whatever maximizes the good and minimizes the bad for all that are involved. And we can look at our own compliance code and pick out guideline 2.09 here, which focuses primary attention on implementing whatever is the most effective treatment procedure. And it has a bit of this utilitarian flavor to it. That is, whatever produces the greatest outcome in relation to a given behavior or acquisition or reduction goal. But as we see at the end of that last sentence, not just for the client, but for kind of all that are considered, the client and society. The third dominant paradigm that's used to justify ethical behavior is called deontology. Deontology comes from the Greek word for duty, or deon, and is therefore anchored in this idea or notion of duty. Now, deontologists really focus on defining what is good or right relative to behavior and context. And they use virtue ethics and consequentialism really to make their point. Relative to virtue ethics, they argue there are situations in which you should not behave in accordance with a given virtue. For example, if behaving honestly is how we define right behavior, if we face a situation where it is overall better to lie, then virtue theory breaks down. This is because it's not just the virtue that's relevant, but the context within which the behavior occurs that's also relevant. A second aspect of the deontological argument is that the consequences of our action are often outside of our control, and as such are morally and ethically insignificant. Right? So even though we may have a good idea of the probability of an outcome based on our learned history, it's impossible to know all the outcomes that will result from any given response. Therefore, statements of right and wrong and making those determinations only based on consequences or outcomes doesn't really seem fair. In case anyone is curious, Immanuel Kant is probably the most famous deontological ethical philosopher, and he extends further the argument against consequentialism by stating that consequences are also not practically relevant. And he makes this claim for two reasons. The first is the extreme demandingness and response effort that would be required to practically incorporate consequentialism into daily decisions. So as a behavior analyst, requiring that we have an understanding and know all of the consequences for all of our reactions with respect not to just one client, but our entire caseload would require both a significant amount of response effort, and the formulations of the decisions would likely be outside of any kind of objective data, very subjective decisions. Furthermore, he argues that consequentialism fails because it can result in extreme permissiveness. And this argument essentially runs as consequentialism demands, and would thus, of course, permit that in certain circumstances, innocent people should be killed, beaten, lied to, or deprived of material goods to produce a greater benefit for others. So as a result, consequences can conceivably justify any kind of act, as it does not matter how harmful it is to some, as long as it's more beneficial to a greater number of people. So, for example, I doubt many of us would feel excited and as though we were behaving ethically if we used our behavior analytic training to help a corporation maximize the effectiveness and efficiency of capturing and enslaving human beings to work in agricultural fields, regardless of the net benefit to mankind. And I know this is a little bit dramatic, but it kind of hits the point. For those that read ethical philosophy, similar classical examples involve the Chinese violinist, the 5-for-1 organ transplant, and things like that. A few other gripes about consequentialism from deontologists are that focusing on maximizing benefits and minimizing harm seems to remove the possibility of a realm of ethical behavior. There's no way of going beyond one's ethical duty. It doesn't allow for indifference. And in general, it seemingly suggests that all acts are either required or forbidden. Right? We do this benefit, harm, math, and whatever comes out on top is what we should be doing. In addition, there also seems to be no space in the consequentialist argument to show partiality to one's own projects or to one's family, friends, and countrymen. And disallowing partiality toward those with closer social relatedness seemingly contradicts a lot of the recent research in social discounting or kin selection and things like that. So as we develop ethical theories, we'll also have to take into account scientific facts and that come out of different behavioral and non-behavioral disciplines. And a quick example before we kind of move onward from our own compliance code would be guideline 1.05. which it espouses our duties as behavior analysts with respect to professional and scientific relationships. For example, we have a duty to provide services only within the context of a defined professional or scientific relationship or role. We have a duty not to discriminate. We have a duty not to harass or demean people. And these are all duties that we're expected to follow regardless of the net benefit that could be gained by violating them. So for example, if we were faced with a situation where it would be provide greater benefit overall to provide services outside of a given context for whatever reason or a specifically defined role, our guideline says that would be a violation of our duty as a behavior analyst. So to summarize these three kind of ethical paradigms we've discussed very briefly here so far, again, virtue ethics states that moral excellence or virtue is the proper focus of reflection, and rules for action are derivative of these virtues. Consequentialism states that only the results or the consequences of an action determine its moral worth. And deontology anchors duty to a specific behavior based in context. And they argue that mainly because consequences are outside of our control and impractical to calculate, it makes them morally and ethically significant, so we really should just be focusing on the behavior and context. Now, I found a little thing online that's supposed to help you figure out which one you may lean towards or which one you may favor. So I figured I'd throw out the example in case it helps anybody. So suppose it's obvious that someone in help should be need, or someone is in need of some help. Walking down the street, I don't know, maybe someone's laying on the side of the road or something. A utilitarian will point to the fact that the consequences of doing so will maximize the well-being of that individual and perhaps yourself. A deontologist would point to the fact that you should help this individual because in doing so, the individual will be behaving in accordance with an ethical or moral rule, such as do unto others as you would have done unto you. And if we all engage in this duty, follow this rule, then we'll all be better off overall. And a virtue ethicist would point to the fact that helping the person would be charitable or benevolent. And the more people are virtuous that we could tack as charitable or benevolent, the better we all are, again, off as a whole. So now all of this is well and good, but you may be curious about how behavior analytic writers have described ethical behavior and what can be labeled as right or wrong and how it kind of fits within all of this. And I'll start by saying it's not exactly clear precisely how behaviorism fits into previous ethical theories. But in general, there seem to be two camps, if you will, regarding how we define values and ethical behavior and the good. So the first camp, arguably again, is Skinner 53 and Baum 94. And these writers suggest that ethical behavior is behaving with respect to contingencies arranged by another person or institution for the good of others, right? We're following those rules, which seems to perhaps have a little bit of a deontological flair, but that's neither here nor there. Skinner in 1971 also went on further to define the good as being equal to positive reinforcement and bad as being equal to aversive control, primarily in the form of negative reinforcement, but also punishment. That is, those things that are reinforcers we tend to tack as good, and those things that are negative reinforcement or aversive punishment thing, we tend to tack as bad. There are some slippery issues with that when you look at, say, reinforcers like drug addiction and whatnot, but that's, again, a topic for another day. The second camp, arguably, could be Hayes, Strosahl, Wilson, 99, who defined the good relative to verbally construed global desired life consequences. So that is, in the grand scheme of our life, we have these global or desired life outcomes. And based on these global desired life outcomes, we often describe them verbally. So what we would then call as good would be behavior that's in accordance with the verbal language relative to those life outcomes. So that's kind of another way that behaviorists have thought about these ideas. So to tie it all together kind of in one slide, Plato and Aristotle emphasized that we need some kind of understanding of the world in order to determine what's good and bad. Aristotle was also the first to highlight the importance of empirical investigation. Plato highlighted that there are some questions experimentation cannot answer. And as a result, we need some other form of understanding the some other form for understanding the world, which is comprised of logic and other abstract phenomena, such like mathematics, that really has no physical form per se, but allows us to functionally operate on our environment. Bentham and the rest of the consequentialists claimed that the consequences of our actions provide the basis for what we tact as right and wrong. And in modern clinical ethics, these foundational consequences go by the names of beneficence and non-maleficence, right? Maximizing the good, reduction of harm, if you remember your Belmont report and whatnot. And Kant, or Immanuel Kant, excuse me, and the rest of the duty-based ethicists gave us the idea of behavior being the target of concern. In modern clinical ethics, these foundational duties often go by the names of justice and respect for autonomy or respect for persons, right? So for justice, we have a duty to justly allocate our resources with the provision of behavior analytic services, regardless of the good and bad that could come from unjustly allocating resources. That is, say I have a caseload of clients, it's just for me to make sure I spend my time across all of those clients. I shouldn't focus all mine on, say, one particularly troublesome kid, even if spending all my time on one case would increase the overall benefit in life, right? We have a duty to justly allocate our resources. Similarly, for respect for autonomy, this would just be providing choices within behavior analytic interventions and behaving in accordance with the choice made by the client, right? That's our informed consent, all that good stuff. We have a duty to uphold the choices that are made by our clients and or their caregivers. Interestingly enough, both of the above, again, seemingly provide and highlight limitations of the other theory. That is, consequentialists highlight limitations of deontologists, and deontologists highlight limitations of consequentialists. And finally, as we kind of briefly chat about, behavior analysts or behaviorist writers really don't provide specific evidence for one of the above, but behavior analysis has done a great job of highlighting the mechanisms by which virtuous or dutiful or consequentialist behavior of an individual within a group can be differentially selected. Hence, kind of based on all this, if you roll it in, the reason, as we kind of chatted about above, we have a conglomeration of verbal behavior that can be construed as virtue-based, duty-based, and consequentialist within the professional and ethical compliance code. So to take a peek at our roadmap again here briefly, so when we start to ask why we should adhere to certain ethical rules, the answer really becomes difficult. And in the absence of data relative to both the function of ethical rules as well as what is most efficient toward attaining those functions, we're left using logic to justify our action. Using logic, three dominant paradigms have come to dominate most of Western ethics, but again, this list isn't comprehensive. There are some more out there that are likely relevant. And our current code has language in it to suggest all three might currently be present to justify our own rules that are meant to guide behavior analyst behavior, despite this seeming contradictory nature of some of these ethical theories. So all of this is good and well, but you might find yourself at this point be asking, why should I care about any of this stuff? This guy's been chatting for a while now. Well, I'm going to argue that you should care for two reasons. The first is for yourself. And the second reason I argue that you should care is for the profession of behavior analysis. So as for you, you likely make a variety of decisions every day when practicing as a behavior analyst that are covered somewhere within the professional and ethical compliance code. So for example, 1.01, reliance on scientific knowledge. Likely you are behaving in accordance with this guideline every day. A humorous way to think about this that has been described in many clinical ethics writings is that ethics and ethical decisions are not like fine dinnerware. That is, we don't pull out our ethics and our code of ethics once a year on special occasions, right? We engage in this stuff daily. So my question to you is, why do you omit the ethical behavior you do in all of those daily choices? You know, what are the socially mediated or non-socially mediated consequences that maintain your ethical behavior? You know, what is the function of your ethical behavior is kind of what we're getting at. And relatedly, we've chatted about the dominant ethical theories in philosophy up to this point in written history. How does the function of your ethical behavior fit within the logic espoused by those ethical theories? And I don't necessarily expect anyone to have an answer here today. And plus, previous research suggests that verbal reports on our own behavior are likely to be inaccurate at least some percent of the time, right? But I think it might be helpful moving forward to begin thinking about our daily ethical choices kind of like an ethical preference assessment. That is, when confronted with an ethical decision each day, you can start by observing whether or not you adhere to the guidelines set forth in the Professional and Ethical Compliance Code. And arguably more important, you can start observing why you are adhering or why you are not adhering. That is, how are you justifying your action? You know, what does that verbal behavior look like? And just like preference assessments with the people we work with, if you start tracking this over time, you'll likely develop a database understanding of your preference for verbal behavior relative to justifying why you're engaging in ethical or unethical behavior. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, over time, you'd also be able to observe the consequences of various ethical decisions and develop a better understanding of the function of your own ethically related behaviors. And all of this, engaging in this kind of ethical preference idea, I think I see a question from somebody over there raising your hand. Go ahead.
Well, wouldn't understanding the function of ethical behaviors be dependent on the context within?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that that's exactly kind of the point. And that's what we often chat about with our code of ethics anyways, or in ethical consults, is that depending on the context and the various bits of information that are present within a given ethical decision, that will likely determine your course of action. And so it's exactly, I think, that kind of information that if we start collecting data on or paying attention to, that would allow us to better understand the environmental conditions that lead to various ethical behaviors in context, as well as the verbal behavior we use to try to justify why we're doing it. Cool. Let's see. Yeah. So as I was mentioning, all of the above, if you start engaging in this ethical preference assessment, data collection and what have you, likely over time, it'll result in you developing a data-based ethical framework that is much more shaped by the contingencies that operate on our ethical verbal and nonverbal behavior, as opposed to just kind of blindly following the rules. And as we know from research based on rule-governed and contingency-shaped behavior, having more of a contingency-shaped ethical framework would likely allow you to be more adaptable to shifting contingencies over time. Now, the same type of functional analysis could also be extended out to the entire field of behavior analysis. So although we may like to believe that the behavior of other behavior analysts, say Joe Schmo in New Jersey or whatever, has little effect on us, we all work with and interact with a variety of individuals in order to fulfill our behavior analytic functions. As defined by Malott in 2003, an interlocking behavioral contingency involves an interaction of two or more individuals. In this interaction, any element of an individual behavioral contingency functions as an environmental event for the behavior of another individual. And this set of interrelated behaviors of several individuals often results in an aggregate product. So factory lines are a commonly used example of kind of highlighting an interlocking behavioral contingency. But other examples of interlocking behavioral contingencies more familiar to us might be therapist-to-therapist therapy sessions. That is, say, morning therapist comes in and targets a variety of programs and skill acquisition targets within a given child's program. Based on what the therapist may or may not get to in that morning, that directly creates an environmental product that creates contingencies for, say, the afternoon therapist and what it is that they're going to be working on. And you can kind of see how this back and forth of interlocking behavioral contingencies could play out across therapy sessions or from one day to the next. Another example might be the data that's produced by the direct therapists that serve as the antecedent stimulus for our behavior. And in turn, that results in behavior that then provides an environmental event for our direct therapists and whatnot. And all of these interlocking behavioral contingencies between you and your direct staff within your clinical caseload result in a clinical product, right? Some degree of success in clinical intervention. And as you have multiples of these over time, this clinical product gets selected by people that need intervention, right? Kids with autism, adolescents with Asperger's, adults that want to quit smoking or whatnot. And this idea of selection of interlocking behavioral contingencies through the consumption of some aggregate product produced by the interlocking behavioral contingencies is known as a meta-contingency. And in a meta-contingency, different topographies can be emitted by different individuals participating in an IBC, or an interlocking behavioral contingency, or in some other cases, several individuals in a group may emit the same topography. And this might be similar when we think about the profession of behavior analysis as a whole. So within a group, we have a lot of direct line staff that are all emitting similar topographies. You have a group of BCBAs or program directors that are all emitting a set of similar topographies. And within meta-contingencies that involve the same topography, there are also two possibilities in terms of the consequences that maintain those behaviors. In one scenario, the same consequence maintains the behavior of every individual in the group, which we would call a group contingency. Now, in knowing the reinforcers that maintain our own behavior, this likely seems, this seems unlikely for us. But the second aspect would be when individual behavior is acquired and maintained by independent individual contingencies. And this seems much more similar when we think about behavior analysts as a group to what is likely going on with each of our own behavior. And this latter set here corresponds to what Glenn calls a macro contingency. So if we start to think about the behavior of behavior analysts and their intervention teams, kind of in the scope of these meta and macro contingencies, then perhaps this is where we can find the function or the purpose of our code of ethics. That is, the function of a code of ethics might be to provide rules pertaining to the proximate and ultimate consequences for individuals behaving within those interlocking group and macro contingencies that are meta contingencies. To kind of provide an example that maybe makes this more salient, let's say 80% of behavior analysts within the United States or the world all started to lie to caregivers and clients or submit fraudulent billing statements and use non-empirically based treatments. The probability is that the aggregate product from all of our individual interlocking behavioral contingencies, the aggregate product that's known as ABA therapy would likely be affected if that happened. And subsequently, less clients would access and seek out our services. So each of our individual jobs would be impacted regardless of our individual behavior. So perhaps the function of a code of ethics is to provide the rules that, if engaged by most members of the profession, will increase the effectiveness and efficiency of the aggregate product that is applied behavior analytics services. And in turn, this would increase the probability of our survival as a profession. And so it's to this end that I think you should also care about the philosophical premises underlying the BACB Professional and Ethical Compliance Code. As mentioned before, we have no data to support why we have the rules we do in the Professional and Ethical Compliance Code. But if we collect data on the verbal behavior that we choose to include in the Professional and Ethical Compliance Code, as well as why we're saying that behavior in our code is right or wrong or good or bad, then over time we can likely get a better understanding of our ethical preferences as a profession. And subsequently, we can analyze the impact of those rules on the profession relative to other disciplines that are also competing for the same clientele in a crowded medical marketplace, but perhaps have different ethical preferences. That is, by examining and understanding our ethical preference relative to both behavior in context as well as the verbal behavior we use to justify, we can see how those ethical preferences compare to other professions who may have different ethical preferences. And within that, we can develop a more robust and adaptive code based to whatever goals of our profession is. All right. So in summary, when we stop and think about it, providing justification for why we have specific ethical rules can be really difficult. Especially as behavior analysts, we're used to having some kind of objective behavioral data to guide our decision making. In the absence of data, we can use the work of many really smart people that have come before us and provided logic-based ethical theories for justifying ethical behavior, kind of why we're doing what we do. And in fact, we already do so. As we saw, different flavors of all of these theories are already present in our professional and ethical compliance code. But also, as we just saw, justification based on these different ethical theories can contradict each other in certain circumstances. So because of that, it seems that starting to be aware of and ideally collecting data on the ethical decisions that we make and the context that surrounds those and how we're justifying those decisions can be beneficial. And we can do this, again, at the level of those individual guidelines. Why are we following those individual guidelines? When various guidelines conflict, how are we choosing among those and how are we choosing to justify that? And also we can think about the code of ethics as a whole. Over time, I argued that collecting these kinds of data will allow us to develop a better understanding of the function of these ethical rules in our own lives as well as for the profession as a whole, so we can subsequently improve on the effectiveness and efficiency by which those rules control behavior toward those functions. And perhaps more importantly, engaging in this analysis will bring ethical rules to be more closely shaped by relevant contingencies, such that we'll have a more flexible and adaptable ethical framework that we can apply to novel situations, as well as changing contingencies across time and geographical space as we continue to grow. And as I mentioned before, it seems that the benefits of this type of analysis can occur at both the level of the individual practitioner as well as the profession of ABA. I want to thank you guys for listening to that spiel. I also want to point out before we go to questions, there's my email address if people have questions they want to email me, and also the Objective Ethics Project. If you guys are interested in thinking about more objective approaches and collecting data in some of the ways that I've said here today, I encourage you to check out that website. We're currently working on a few different mobile applications that will allow us to start gathering some of these verbal reports and data. Yeah, so thank you guys, and I guess I'll just open it up for questions if anybody has any. You can type it into the chat, or you feel free to just start chatting. Yeah, go ahead. Manish, is that your name?
Yeah. What if ethics has nothing to do with what's good and bad?
What do you mean by that?
What I'm suggesting is, if you look at natural selection, what if ethics is basically a conditioned set of rules or unnatural rules given how we build society to level the playing field so everybody has the same chance of survival or not, and it has nothing to do with good or bad?
Yeah, so I think that that's a very real possibility. And I think as we collect data, it's also very possible that all those theories we talked about today or that have been proposed will be irrelevant. But kind of like what you had mentioned in there, if, say, the function of the rules is to level the playing field so everyone has a fair chance or whatnot, then I think if that turns out to be the function, then it would also be good to have data to suggest that that's true. And then we can actually adapt and modify the rules. And perhaps there's rules we have now in our code of ethics that are irrelevant or that are kind of vestigial rules from earlier codes of ethics that we've kind of copied and kept over time. Does that answer your question, I think?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I kind of see what you're saying, and I would agree that it's hard to imagine that there is an objective like good and bad. And like you're saying, if ethics and ethical rules are really, it's just verbal behavior, then I think the purpose of this kind of analysis would be to be more honest about that, essentially. So if they are, again, kind of selected, or they're these unnatural rules or whatnot, however you say, then it's good to examine that and recognize and show like, hey guys, there's no inherent goodness or badness. There's no virtue that we all should be attaining to aspire. Perhaps we can just look at the function of this verbal behavior and improve the effectiveness by which those can govern behavior.
That makes sense.
Yeah, and it's also possible that everything that I just proposed too, if we start collecting data, will also be false. I think the main curiosity that I've had since I've found behavior analysis when I was in my Master's of Bioethics program is that we don't have a lot of data on all this stuff. And I think it's important rules. And starting in, I believe it was this last January, if you egregiously violate a rule, you can lose your right to practice as a behavior analyst. And so if we think about these things and the consequences of violating the rules, it seems like we should have a good understanding of why we're espousing the rules we do. And so collecting data on that, wherever it leads us, seems like it'll be beneficial for us.